Good work. Your reputation is well deserved. Get inside. The subway's about to leave.
Just 3 more days and Jill Valentine will be able to leave Raccoon City and her nightmarish, zombie-filled past behind her. Yep, just 3 more days. That is, unless a shadowy organization were to send a bioorganic weapon hell-bent on slaughtering the remaining members of STARS, effectively bungling her escape plan. Of course, this is exactly the plot of Resident Evil 3, a mostly faithful remake of the PlayStation game of the same name from 1999. Resident Evil 3 is a reimagining in the style of Resident Evil 2 from last year, but like original Resident Evil 3, the remake just doesn't hold up to the standards set by Resident Evil 2. The game shifts focus from puzzle-solving and tension to a more action-heavy approach, which, while not necessarily a bad thing, isn't quite what I'm looking for out of Resident Evil. From the moment Resident Evil 3 starts, it's clear what the tone of the game is going to be. While answering a phone call from a member of STARS telling you to get out of your apartment, a large, imposing figure, Nemesis, bursts through your walls. You frantically escape him and your plan to leave Raccoon City gets pushed up a few days. Along the way, you meet up with Umbrella mercenaries who have been tasked with getting the remaining citizens out of the city. Jill decides to help them and teams up with the floppiest-haired merc, Carlos, to get the train running so she can leave with the rescue party, all the while taking down any zombies that might pose an issue and avoiding the Nemesis as best she can. The setting in Resident Evil 3 is terrific. Running around the streets of Raccoon City is enjoyable, and you can tell that Capcom had a lot of fun designing the storefronts and shops that you pass by. That said, despite the fact that it's crawling with zombies, the world feels pretty barren. The streets serve as essentially hallways that lead you to a room or two with something of interest. This leaves the world feeling small, which is a problem that plagues the entirety of the game. The scope of Resident Evil 2 is such that you're surprised by how much they're able to squeeze out of the police station. The clandestine puzzles that allow you to access various parts of the precinct are ridiculous, but they add to the game's charm. This is something that's noticeably lacking in Resident Evil 3. You'll travel to various locations throughout the game, including a quick truncated trip to the police station, but it lacks Resident Evil 2's magnetism. If you've played Resident Evil 2, you'll also notice that the combat feels a little different. Jill is slightly more adept than Leon or Claire, which makes sense because they're a rookie cop or a college student respectively. Jill can perform quick dodges, which, if timed correctly, will execute a roll that can be followed up with an attack that slows down time, allowing you to get a few crucial shots in. This is especially handy when trying to escape Nemesis, as he has no problem getting right up on you and whacking you with his big old tentacle arm. Jill apparently also got the last durable knife in Raccoon City, as degradation has been removed. This is accounted for by making the knife all but useless though, so you can go ahead and toss that in the first item box you come across. Don't worry about needing to conserve ammo, there will be plenty of that lying around, and you likely won't miss anything thanks to the return of the extremely helpful map system that paints rooms that still have a collectible item in them with a different color. This is one of the smartest updates to Resident Evil's formula, and I'm glad to see it make a return. With Jill's new combat moves and ability to slow down time, it's only natural that Resident Evil 3 would take on a more action-heavy approach to gameplay than Resident Evil 2. On one hand, this makes sense. The original game was more of an action-focused game in comparison to the first two in the series. However, I can't help but feel a little disappointed by this. I thought Resident Evil 2 struck a really clever balance of puzzle solving and action. Combat encounters felt tense as zombies moved unpredictably, and you'd often be better off avoiding contact with them altogether. Resident Evil 3 is more about wiping enemies off the map, even going so far as to put you in big dumb wave-based arena fights late in the game. Resident Evil 2 also struck gold with their inclusion of Mr. X, a threatening figure in a trench coat who would stalk you as you moved through the police station. You never knew when he was going to show up, you couldn't kill him, and his heavy footsteps were enough to have you white-knuckling the controller. Mr. X is one of the reasons that I was so looking forward to the Resident Evil 3 remake. After all, the whole game is about escaping a big, threatening mega monster with a target placed squarely on your back. A game that revolved around a Mr. X-style persistent threat that would appear when you least expect it would be awesome. And I still think that. This just isn't that game. It's not that Nemesis isn't capable of stressing you out, but I'd say that encounters with him are more frustrating than they are tense. Like I mentioned earlier, Nemesis can leap over you and knock you on your ass, but nothing about encounters with Nemesis feel dynamic. Every time he reared his handsome little head, I would respond with a less than enthusiastic, "Oh, of course." It was predictable, and once you knew his tricks, almost trivial. The original Resident Evil 3 did some interesting things with Nemesis. When he'd arrive on the scene, you'd typically be given a choice. Run and hide, smart, or stay and fight, dumb. Choosing the latter would reward you with high-powered ammo and weapon parts, but the fights were difficult. While stunning the remake's Nemesis will result in him dropping presents, this never feels like an emergent choice. It would have been really interesting to see the team experiment with some branching paths that come as a result of you making a choice, rather than simply spawning Nemesis for you to shoot at or not. Not to mention, you only have to avoid him for the first few hours of the game. Without spoiling too much, after a certain point he stops showing up in a way that could impede your progress at all, and instead becomes a set piece that you'll largely hold up on the control stick to get away from. Overall, the implementation of Nemesis in Resident Evil 3 is disappointing. I want to be clear that I don't dislike Resident Evil 3. I had a lot of fun reliving certain moments from the original game in a more recent Resident Evil style, but I did find myself wishing that the game struck a similar balance of puzzles and combat to Resident Evil 2. Not to mention, there are large sections of the original Resident Evil 3 that are just missing from the remake. I tend to think that you aren't missing out on too much of the Resident Evil 3 experience with the omission of these segments, but it is still notable given how faithful a recreation Resident Evil 2 was. Since Resident Evil 2 released just over a year before this one, I get the impression that some segments may have been cut for time. On the other hand, a surprisingly delightful addition to the package came in the form of Project Resistance, the separately executable asymmetrical multiplayer mode included with Resident Evil 3. I remember when word about Project Resistance started circulating online. I was not thrilled. A multiplayer Resident Evil was something that I had no interest in, and something I had no faith they could actually pull off. Raccoon City! Outbreak! To my surprise, though, Project Resistance is really fun and the most interesting thing about Resident Evil 3. In Project Resistance, you play as either one of a cast of several characters, including a teen named Martin Sandwich.
What's going on?
Or your choice of the evil director. The conceit is that the director has rounded up a group of 4 civilians, and they need to work together to make their way out of, essentially, an escape room filled with zombies. You have to locate puzzle items or complete objectives to move through levels and eventually escape the facility, all the while the director is spawning an army of traps, zombies, undead dogs, and other mutated creatures to stop you, each of which you can take direct control of on the fly.
Your deaths will be further evidence.
Each character has their own strengths and abilities, whether that's to locate a puzzle item more quickly or to be able to pick out and disarm traps. Similarly, each director can spawn different enemies and boss monsters. Project Resistance is a ton of fun and a decent realization of Resident Evil in a multiplayer formula. I wouldn't have guessed it, but this is probably the reason I'll return to Resident Evil 3. I'm glad Resident Evil 3 exists. Seeing some moments and locations from the original game recreated in the gorgeous-looking RE engine, it was a treat, and gave me the occasional nostalgic glee that I felt playing through Resident Evil 2's remake. The game's proclivities towards a more action-heavy tone, limited scope, and narrow use of Nemesis are disappointing though. Project Resistance certainly adds to the package's value proposition, and in a vacuum Resident Evil 3 is fine, but it's impossible not to compare it to last year's Resident Evil 2, which, at times, this game almost feels like an add-on to. I don't normally assign a rating to games I review, but in this case it almost seems appropriate. This one gets 3 out of 5.
Well, that's good thinking.